I'm going to tell you today about the 3 most common things that are often fed to chickens that shouldn't be. I'm inside hiding from the rain today. I'm in my husband's music studio. The upside to that is I get to use the fancy lights. The very first one on my list is toxic plants. Chickens can't taste a great deal of flavours, but what they can taste is bitterness, and luckily most toxic plants are highly bitter, so it's unlikely that if your chickens have access to plenty of food that they're going to eat a disastrous amount of these toxic foods. However, some things are toxic even in a really small amount. So if you're bringing your chickens plants, or if you're letting them free range in your garden, it's really crucial to be aware of what things they can eat and which ones they shouldn't. The Nightshade family is quite toxic to chickens, so that includes the greens from potatoes and tomatoes, and of course tobacco plants as well. And then there's the nightshades that we know of as deadly nightshade and black nightshade. None of those should be fed to chickens. Common plants you might have in your garden include irises, clematis, ivy, foxglove, hydrangeas, rhododendrons and tulips. Other things include the leaves from rhubarb and common toxic weeds like hemlock and buttercup. Why don't we feed these things? Obviously, they can make them really sick and they can die. Plants can be really nutritional and they can be helpful in really small doses even if they are toxic. Sometimes animals will take really small microdoses if they've got a problem with a parasite, but generally speaking they won't overdose on them unless they're hungry and they've got nothing else to eat. There are, however, a lot of leafy greens that you can be feeding your chickens. Usually anything that you can eat, the chickens can eat too. And then there's also the scrap things like the leaves from broccoli and the leaves from Brussels sprouts that we don't usually eat, but the chickens love them. So you can give them your silver beet or chard, spinach, your lettuce. They also love the greens that you can forage to put in your salads like plantain and chickweed. And if you want to give them a treat, try something like apples or watermelon or fresh corn. They love them. Just be sure that they're in small enough doses and that they've already had their other food so that they're not getting too much sugar to throw out the gut balancer bacteria in their crop, which we will talk more about when we get to number 3. What are your chickens' favourite things to eat? Tell me about them in the comments below. Have you found anything that surprised you that was toxic for your chickens? Please tell us about it below as well. Number 2 is feeding your chickens whole eggs or whole egg shells, or even when you've cut the eggs, when you've cracked them in half ready to bake, they're still recognizable as eggs, and they are the ones you don't want to be feeding your chickens. They will recognize eggs as food and they can start eating their own eggs, which is not what we want when we're raising chickens for the eggs. I understand that a lot of people do it to close the loop. Chickens do need quite a lot of phosphorus and calcium to make their eggshells, and so it seems silly to throw them out and then buy supplemental feed for them that has these nutrients in it. But what you can do instead is warm them in an oven until they're completely dry, and that will make sure that you've also killed off any salmonella or anything like that that might be growing on the shells. And then you can either crush them with your hands or a mortar and pestle, or put them into a food processor or a blender and crush them up so they're nice and little, and then you can put them out for the chickens to help themselves too. Alternatives to feeding back their eggshells are to buy something like an oyster grit, or sometimes you can buy mussel shells. And chickens allowed to free range will often find insects that have got hard shells as well, and they're relatively high in calcium. And number 3 on my list is starchy foods. One of the most commonly asked questions for new chicken raisers is, can chickens eat bread? And the answer is actually, well, sometimes. Like so many foods, the poison is in the dose. You can have these starchy foods in small quantities and it doesn't cause a problem. But if you start feeding the chickens large volumes of these starchy foods, they can end up with like a dysbiosis happening in their gut, where the wrong bacteria start growing in their crop. And they develop a thing called sour crop, which 1 is gross and 2 can make them really sick and they can die. What foods am I talking about here? 1 is obviously bread, 2 is cooked pasta, white rice, cooked oatmeal, or what we call here porridge or rolled oats. And predominantly the problem with these foods is that they're not in their raw, natural, crushed up state. They have been cooked and they develop this bizarre sludgy stuff, which is a perfect medium to grow bacteria on, which when you fill up their crop with that sort of sludgy stuff, 1, it can ball up and cause blockages, and 2, it can allow this overgrowth of bacteria, which we're trying desperately to avoid. So to avoid it balling up, you want to give it in small doses mixed with other feed, or feed them the other feed first and give these as a bit of a treat or a top up. And to avoid the bacterial overgrowth, what you want to do is maybe soak it in some apple cider vinegar overnight, and that can help break down some of the fibers and break up the sludge, and also it adds some acidity to help stop those bad bacteria growing. The other thing with those starchy foods is they're not particularly nutritious. They don't have the nutrition that you're going to need for your chickens to get out of their food to be laying well for you or growing well for you if they're meat birds. I understand that often these things we're feeding to them to save money, and if you want some hints and tips on how to feed chickens without using feed store feed, which Lord knows it's becoming so much more expensive and harder to get at the moment, check out this video here which tells you all about a whole bunch of different ways that you can feed your chickens without relying on feed store feed. I hope you found that helpful. If you have, hit the like button and I will see you in the next one.